When I was 10 years old, my mom took me to see a famous exhibition at the AGO by Jean-Michel Basquiat. Like most art-obsessed kids, I was immediately transfixed by the ginormous canvases breaking every rule I thought I understood about art. I was having a mental orgasm trying to decode the layers of meaning woven within the art straight from Basquiat's soul. Like I was Indiana Jones searching for the kingdom of the crystal skull. This little snot-nosed white kid from upper middle class Toronto was learning about the history of racism, colonialism, rampant unchecked capitalism, all likely for the first time in his life, all because Basquiat brought chaos to an industry that was obsessed with order 2 decades prior. Basquiat's art sparked a deep passion for all things radical for me growing up. I was no longer looking at Duchamp's urinal, for example, or Picasso's cubes, or Warhol's cans of soup, with a sense of bewilderment. For the first time in my life, I understood them for what they were, just revolutionary and radical triumphs of the soul. Art became the symbol for all things humanity for me. When I got a little down on myself, or my ego got a little too strung out, it was always art that leveled me off. I studied art like a religion. And like any passionately religious person, I got slightly irritated to borderline irate when a work of art was misconstrued for whatever reason. We see corporations and governments do it all the time. To stick with the Basquiat theme, for example, literally like 3 years ago, Tiffany & Co., the diamond company, unveiled a work of art by Basquiat that was previously in a warehouse for 30 years just to market their diamond campaign. This painting could have been one of the few paintings that changed my life and millions of other lives. But nope, this blood diamond company thought it'd be better off sitting in a warehouse for 30 years. Boo-hoo, I know I sound like the Monster Energy of Satan lady we all love. But stories are important. Stories are how we communicate. There are good stories and there are bad stories. Unfortunately, when I go on social media and go on ArtTok and stuff, I can't help but notice a large percentage of the art there makes up the latter camp. I know. If Conor McGregor was here, he'd probably say something like, Who the fuck is this guy?
Who the fuck is that?
Well, actually, Mr. McGregor, I'm OG Bubby Jostin. I've curated multiple exhibitions for one of Canada's dopest art schools. Bitch. What's up? When I talk of bad storytelling, I merely mean redundant storytelling. We've all seen it before, the 16-year-old white kid on social media innocently mimicking Basquiat's aesthetic, but accidentally producing something with, at best, zero substance, or at worst, ignorantly racist. Although social media likes to gang up on these people, it's sort of hard to blame them when they don't have any art history education. And at the same time, I also struggle to blame social media because as it's entirely dependent on aesthetics, of course, a Basquiat or Haring copycat is going to rise to the top of the algorithm because that's what's popular. Like, we all know radicalism doesn't reward the algorithm. So if it's not the fault of the artist, nor is it really of social media, why is it that so many artists are copying Basquiat and his contemporaries? Why is the popular artist social media stuck 20, 30 years in the past? I can tell you with confidence, today's contemporary art galleries are not struck by this phenomenon. They're producing dope shit. So why are the artists of social media choosing to abide by the algorithm rather than reality? It took a lot of research, but I think I have a solution. Mark Fisher's concept, Hauntology, perfectly captures what's happening with the Basquiat copying phenomenon on social media. For Fisher, our culture is haunted by the ghosts of our lost futures. Times when artistic rebellion seemed capable of producing genuine change. Basquiat represents this to a T. A moment when art could still shock, disrupt, and manifest into something entirely new. When Fisher writes about the slow cancellation of our future, he's talking about our inability to produce cultural norms that don't reference the past. ArtTok creators, for example, aren't just capturing Basquiat's aesthetic. They're grasping for that rebellious energy Basquiat's work once created. But it becomes increasingly impossible to generate anew in this algorithmically optimized world. In capitalist realism, Fisher argues that capitalism absorbs and neutralizes any and all resistance to it. Nothing makes this clearer than looking at Basquiat's anti-establishment art. Once a genuine threat to institutional power, transforms into a set of recognizable BS visual tropes. According to Fisher, the radical has been domesticated, commodified, neutralized, and shoved down our throats as content. This brings us to Baudrillard's simulacra, which helps explain why these Basquiat copycats feel so empty, despite being full of technical and artistic proficiencies. In this book, Baudrillard theorizes 4 areas of simulation, and I'm going to talk about the 4th one, the one furthest away from reality. In fact, Baudrillard would say that this area of simulation has no bearing to reality whatsoever. The Basquiat copycats on ArtTok exist in the 4th order of the simulation. They're not trying to represent Basquiat's reality whatsoever. The Basquiat copycats in their art live in this thing called the hyper-reality, or the hyperreal. It is the 4th area of the simulation where Basquiat's aesthetic style circulates as signifiers that are completely divorced and devoid of what they originally meant. Take Basquiat's crown, for example, which we've all seen and know and love. I actually have it hanging right there. So the crown once symbolized black excellence, and to be specific, it's a reference to the Ethiopian word for king. But now, when you see a Basquiat crown motif on any work of art, it is merely just a design prop. The people who draw those crowns have no idea of its historical context. It's completely divorced from the original meaning. Another example is the famous anatomical diagrams Basquiat draws. I have another print right there of it. They were once a symbol of the rampant, unchecked capitalism and the exploitation of black bodies in the US. But now they're just visual tropes. Most people who paint those have no idea that's where they came from. When these artists copy Basquiat, they're not reinforcing Basquiat himself or the social conditions that he was responding to. They're referencing other copies of Basquiat. A person who draws an anatomical diagram is referencing the visual trope, not the actual meaning behind it. Therefore, they're just referencing other copies and are devoid of the actual substance and meaning of the work of art. What this does is, this creates a closed system of reference that spirals further and further away from any grounding to the lived experience and reality of the work of art. The human component of the work of art, what makes it special, what makes it radical, what gives it meaning. And the last philosopher I want to talk about is Guy Debord in his book Society of the Spectacle. For Debord, authentic social life has been replaced by Baudrillard's hyperreal. The Basquiat copycat phenomenon represents this exactly. What we see on ArtTok and all these other social medias aren't genuine artists. We're seeing people perform what it means to be an artist. They're acting, essentially. Crucially, Debord uses this concept of recuperation to describe how capitalism and mainstream culture has absorbed and neutralized any and all radical ideas that come from art. TikTok has transformed Basquiat's anti-establishment art into a trendy, marketable style, recuperating its revolutionary potential, replacing it with a marketable, harmless, that easily digestible form of content. The platforms don't just redistribute these copies, it actively shapes the production of the copies through its algorithmic incentives. What Debord calls the spectacle isn't just the images being shared, but it's the entire ecosystem, the whole platform around them. What happens is, first the artist performs video showcasing their creative process. They get engagement metrics. The comment section debates about authenticity, and then purchase links are in the bios, and the whole cycle is reproduced. In essence, according to Debord, Basquiat's art style has disappeared and been replaced by this pseudo-world of representation, or to use Baudrillard's claim, the hyperreal. These three theoretical perspectives, Fisher, Baudrillard, and Debord, boom, create an almost disturbing cycle of cultural recuperation. 1. Authentic artistic rebellion emerges. And this is Basquiat in the 80s and 90s. An authentic artist comes and produced rebellious and revolutionary art that changes the times. 2. Basquiat's art slowly gets stripped of its aura through representation. We see more and more Basquiat copycats pop onto the scene, and slowly the meaning of what it means to make a Basquiat slowly loses its value. 3. Debord's hyperreal comes into play. After enough copycats permeate the market, Eventually the copycats don't even copy Basquiat, and they start copying other copycats. And eventually the cyclical cycle comes and they start reproducing nothing. And all this art is devoid of any true meaning and sanctity. 4. After Baudrillard comes Debord and his theory of recuperation. The simulation, these spectacle, the copycats end up becoming the spectacle for consumption. People enjoy the Basquiat and Keith Haring copycats because they're easier to buy, easier to get, and they produce the same sentimental value because they have the same aesthetics, but they're devoid of that true artistic essence, that meaning, because people don't need that. They just want easily digestible art. 5. Fisher. The culture becomes haunted by these lost futures. We've realized that we've accepted these copycats, these fakes, as true. Like, we've accepted them as reality, and we care more about how many metrics on the algorithm than the actual true artistic content. And Fisher argues that's how we lead to rising depression rates and all this stuff in capitalist society, because we don't get the same substance that we need from true art in this content-driven capitalist machine. But to be honest, this book's worth another YouTube video. I'll go into that later. If you could take one thing away from what I'm trying to say with this theoretical synthesis, is that these social media platforms aren't neutral spaces where copying happens to occur. They're active agents that accelerate and intensify these processes. TikTok's algorithm, through its preference for visually striking and immediately recognizable content, creates this perfect environment for the flattening of Basquiat's multi-dimensional critiques of society, turns it into easily digestible, easily reproducible visual tropes. This results in a situation where authentic artistic rebellion becomes all but impossible, because copies seem more real than the originals, and art is valued not for its conceptual depth or political significance, but for its ability to generate easily digestible content. The sad reality is that it's not like these Basquiat copies are simply aesthetically derivative. They represent the complete inversion of everything Basquiat stood for. When algorithms determine visibility, authenticity becomes secondary to recognizability. Not to get dramatic here, but what we're witnessing is not just plain old aesthetic mimicry. We're witnessing the foundational collapse of art's most critical function. As social media rewards visual immediacy over conceptual depth, we will see similar patterns flatten across all forms of art. The tragedy isn't just that Basquiat's style has been reduced to a template, but that very possibility of genuinely disruptive art becomes increasingly remote. As artists, we find ourselves in a paradoxical time period. Never in the history of humanity has there been more people creating, but at the same time, such creations and sharing have never been so devoid of originality. This isn't about blaming young artists for copying Basquiat. It's about recognizing the systemic forces that make such copying inevitable. Whatever form it takes, the next artistic revolution will not look like Basquiat's, because it can't. It will need to find new ways to confront a system that has already incorporated rebellion into its business model. If you're a Basquiat fan or an art fan or any type of fan, subscribe to BM for more cultural analysis. Boom.